Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 636, and today is July 16th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot of news to get through on today's show, but first, want to talk about the Libertarian Institute where we are holding our summer fundraiser. If you can, head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation. It will help us to reach our goal and to continue to produce the great content that we produce at the Institute. The Institute is far beyond just the show and the articles I write. We've published 14 books, daily op-eds, and other news stories and podcasts. So check out the Libertarian Institute. If you like it, make a donation. Help us to meet our goals so we could continue to tell the truth and fight against the war state and their propaganda. All right, with that, let's get into the show today. First up here, this is concerning. Poland considering shooting down Russian missiles over Ukraine, but wants NATO support. So the Russian foreign minister said Friday that Poland was exploring the idea of shooting down Russian missiles over Ukraine if they are deemed a threat to Polish territory. Now, what that means, I think, would be a pretty big question. And it does seem that if we are only talking about a few missiles that may cross over Polish territory, and in that case, Poland isn't going to go out of its way to shoot anything down that's real close to the border, but rather things that are well within Polish territory, well, it might not be such a large provocation. However, if they do start shooting down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory, Russia is going to view this as another step towards NATO being a direct party in the war in Ukraine, which means NATO being at direct war with Russia. So, Poland recently signed a bilateral security deal with Ukraine, which Zelinsky said included a mechanism for Poland to intercept Russian missiles, but the foreign minister said it was still just an idea. At this stage, this is an idea. What our agreement said is we will explore this idea, he said during a speech at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., according to Politico. The foreign minister said Poland would have the right to intercept Russian missiles if they were entering Polish territory by mistake, but said that the dilemma was that debris caused damage if shot down over Poland. And so I think what he's pointing to is that it could actually be more dangerous for Poles, for Poland to shoot down these missiles, rather than just allowing these missiles that are mistakenly crossing small amounts of Polish territory to continue along their way. So he adds, the Ukrainians are saying, please, we will not mind, do it over our airspace when they're in imminent danger of crossing into Polish territory. To my mind, that's self-defense, but we are exploring the idea. So this is, I think, where it gets more problematic, right, is that they start shooting down these missiles within Ukrainian territory. Russian missiles have entered Polish airspace during the Russian bombardment of Ukraine, but only briefly. Back in November of 2022, a Ukrainian air defense missile landed in Poland and killed 2 civilians. Ukrainian officials initially claimed it was a Russian missile, but that was an attempt to get NATO to directly intervene in the war, but it turned out that it was the Ukrainian air defense missile that ended up in Poland. A few days before the foreign minister comments, the Polish defense minister said Poland would only shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine if NATO agreed with the plan. He said, if the alliance does not make such a decision, then Poland should in no way make such a decision alone. For now, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is ruling out the idea. He was asked on Sunday about the possibility of Poland shooting down Russian missiles and said, NATO's policy is unchanged. We will not be involved in this conflict. We will not become a part of the conflict, so we support Ukraine in the destruction of Russian aircraft, but NATO would not be directly involved. And of course, this is just, I think, mostly delusions that exist within Brussels and the leaders of the NATO countries. There is probably some reason here to assume that Russia would consider this an escalation. Not trying to, say that they wouldn't. However, to pretend that NATO isn't already a party to this conflict, and when NATO missiles are being used by Ukraine to hit Russian targets within Russia, then, I mean, to say that shooting down a missile would be the line that leads to direct involvement, I think almost sounds a little bit silly. Stoltenberg ruling out the idea doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. Throughout the war, NATO has taken multiple steps it previously ruled out as being too escalatory, including the provision of tanks and fighter jets and allowing Ukraine to strike Russia territory with NATO missiles. And again, I think those are the far more provocative actions, particularly the transfer of NATO weapons to Ukraine that are allowed to attack Russian territory. And pretty soon that's going to include F-16s, according to Blinken and some other NATO leaders over the past week. They do say those planes are supposed to be arriving in Ukraine pretty soon now. So we will see how far that escalates the war. Next up here, this one's a little bit interesting, but maybe not really. Zelinsky says Russia should attend NATOs Ukraine summit. So Zelinsky said on Monday that Russian representatives should attend the NATOs International Summit on the Ukraine war. The comments marked a shift for Zelinsky since he had previously refused to invite Russia to attend international summits where he was pushing his quote-unquote peace formula. Switzerland hosted the summit last month that included representatives from 92 countries, but Russia was not invited. Zelinsky told reporters that he is in the process of planning the NATOs summit. He told Reuters, "I set a goal that in November we would be fully ready plan. I think that representatives of Russia should be at the second summit." Zelensky's comments come as the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been pushing for a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Orban discussed his ideas in a recent visit to Kiev, Moscow, and Beijing. For his efforts, top EU officials are boycotting meetings held in Hungary, which is currently holding the EU's rotating presidency. Zelensky's peace formula calls for a complete Russian withdrawal of Ukrainian territory before peace talks could even begin, which is a non-starter for negotiations with Moscow. During his visit to Kiev, Orban suggested Zelensky consider a ceasefire with Russia as a first step towards a peace deal. Zelensky rejected this idea, but his comments about Russia attending the summit could signal a softening stance. Throughout the war, the only time a peace deal was on the table was back in March and April of 2022, but the US and NATO discouraged Ukraine from signing an agreement and promised to support the fight in Russia. Against Russia. And so, one of the things that I think is interesting here, of course, is Zelinsky has signed this decree that outlawed talks with the Putin government. Now, I am concerned that what Zelinsky is going to try to do here is maybe invite some sort of Russian non-associated with Putin. So maybe they're going to say, oh, there's these Russians in exile living somewhere in the West, and we're going to negotiate with them. So we're going to invite Russians to our summit, but not actually Russians that are capable of negotiating an end to this deal. And so we will see if he's really talking about reversing his decree or if this is just a little bit of rhetorical trickery. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, July 14th. Netanyahu admits he doesn't know if strikes on Gaza safe zone killed Hamas military commander. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has admitted he doesn't know if an Israeli bombing of a tent camp in the Israeli military declared safe zone killed one of Hamas's senior military commanders, that is Mohammed Diaf. So Gaza's health ministry said the strike on the al-Mawasi camp killed at least 90 Palestinians, more than half of them being women and children. And the Israeli Defense Forces had told Palestinian civilians evacuating from Rafah and Khan Yunis to take shelter in the camp, which has now come under multiple Israeli attacks. A 16-year-old Palestinian girl who witnessed the massacre described the scene to Mondo Weiss. "A leg hit me and I saw dismembered bodies a few meters away. I saw a young child screaming. He lost his lower limbs and was crawling on his hands and screaming. The bombs didn't stop and suddenly the boy disappeared. I saw how he vanished before me while I ran and lowered my eyes to the ground, unable to do anything but run." So Israeli officials described the attack as they dropped 5 2,000-pound bombs on a compound in the camp. The IDF claimed to have targeted Daif and Rafa Salmala, the commander of Hamas's Khan Yunis brigade. Hamas denied the claim, saying it was an excuse to justify the massacre. On Saturday night, Netanyahu said he wasn't absolutely certain if the commanders were killed, but said the bombing of the tent camp was good for Israel to try either way. Just the attempt to assassinate Hamas commanders delivers a message to the world, a message that Hamas's days are numbered. And this is what I will be doing next week at the U.S. Congress. I will deliver Israel's message to the United States and the entire world, Netanyahu said. On Sunday, the IDF also said it wasn't sure if Daif was killed. It is still too early to summarize the result of the attack, which Hamas was trying to hide, the IDF chief of staff said. Daif is believed to be the architect of the October 7th attack on southern Israel. According to Reuters, he survived seven previous Israeli assassination attempts, including a 2014 strike that killed his wife and 7-month-old son and 3-year-old daughter. Because of the assassination attempts, it has long been believed that Daif has been living in the vast tunnel network under Gaza. The majority of the tunnels are still intact, according to U.S. intelligence, giving Daif and Hamas's leadership plenty of room to remain underground, which would suggest that he probably wasn't milling around this tent camp city and killed by Israel in this way. And this has been a pattern throughout the conflict where Israel will bomb large swaths and kill hundreds, if not more, people in single strikes, or in this case, you have 5 strikes, but a single attack. And then they'll claim, oh, we were talking a Hamas commander. And even if it is true, it's certainly a war crime to drop 2,000-pound bombs on a tent city packed with women and children. But this is Israel and the United States, and they could essentially do what they want, kill who they want, and just claim, oh, we are targeting Hamas, and everybody just kind of moves on with their day. So really, disturbing the scenes that are happening in Gaza, and knowing that there's never going to be not only any justice for the victims, but it's going to be a while before history really paints Netanyahu and Biden as the monsters that they are for doing this and allowing and facilitating these attacks. All right, next up, this one, Dave DeCamp, July 15th, antiwar.com. Netanyahu to meet with Biden at the White House before addressing Congress. So the man who just blew the lower half of the child apart, left him crawling on the ground before his forces finished him off, is going to be coming to the U.S., where he is going to be warmly received not only by Biden, but by the entire Congress. I'm sure that most of us with any kind of conscience whatsoever are going to be absolutely sick on July 22nd when this happens. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will meet with President Biden at the White House on July 22nd, 2 days before Netanyahu delivers an address to a joint session of Congress, the Times of Israel reported on Monday. The meeting will mark the first time that Biden hosts Netanyahu in Washington since the Israeli leader took power in December of 2022. They have 2 in-person meetings during that time. During the UN General Assembly in New York in September of 2023, when President Biden visited Israel in October of 2023, following the Hamas attack on southern Israel. Biden and Netanyahu have also held frequent phone calls since October 7th to discuss the Israeli military operations in Gaza. Media reports have portrayed the relationship between the two leaders as uneasy, but Biden has provided strong military and political support for Netanyahu's genocidal war. The support continues even as Netanyahu is clearly sabotaging the attempts of chances of a ceasefire deal with Hamas. Israeli officials have told media that Netanyahu doesn't want an agreement before his address to Congress, since he sees it as an opportunity to clinch more American support, which he hopes will increase his domestic support. Netanyahu has a history of controversial addresses to Congress. In 2015, when he delivered a speech opposing the Iran nuclear deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, he also played a key role in pressuring the Trump administration to tear up the agreement, which kept Iran's civilian nuclear program under stringent limits. In 2002, Netanyahu testified before Congress that the U.S. urging the U.S. to invade Iraq, pushing the false narrative that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking, is working, is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons, Netanyahu told the legislators. He also claimed that regime change in Iraq would spy a revolution in Iran. If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you will have enormous positive reverberations on the region, which of course we all know didn't work and absolutely blew up in the US's face. So, just horrible. All right. And look, I'm sure Netanyahu is going to be, very warmly received in Congress, but also very widely believed as well. All right, next up here, this one, UNRWA, UNRWA headquarters in Israel flattened by Israeli military. So the head of the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency, that's UNRWA, said Monday that the organization's headquarters in Gaza City have been flattened as Israel is escalating attacks across the Gaza Strip. Shocking, UNRWA chief Felipe Lanzare wrote on X. UNRWA headquarters in Gaza turned into a battlefield and now flattened, another episode in the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law. Israeli military has waged war against UNRWA in Gaza, killing nearly 200 of the agency's employees. Israel has also accused 12 UNRWA employees of participating in the October 7th attacks on southern Israel, but hasn't produced any evidence to bat the claim. The U.S. and other Western countries immediately suspended funding for UNRWA based on Israel's claims. In March, President Biden signed a bill into law prohibiting further U.S. funding for the agency at least until 2025. In contrast, extensive evidence of Israeli war crimes has not led to any reductions in the U.S. funding for the Israeli military. Instead, the president signed legislation giving Israel another $17 billion in military aid on top of the $3.8 billion it receives every year. And so it just goes to show what a joke the United States has become on the global stage. All right, let's do this one next. Report: Golan tells hostage families that Israel's security establishment wants a deal with Hamas. So the Israeli media reported on Monday that Defense Minister Yoav Gallant met with relatives of Israeli hostages held in Gaza and told them that a deal with Hamas was possible and that it was supported by the Israeli security establishment. Gallant said, according to Israel's Channel 12, "When a deal was not possible, I told you. Now it is possible, so I'm telling you, it's closer than it's ever been. There's a complete unanimity in the defense establishment, the IDF, the Shin Bet, the Mossad. There is no insurmountable security obstacle to a deal from their point of view." Other recent reports have said that Israel's top generals want a ceasefire and see it as the best way to secure the remaining hostages. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and members of his coalition government who have significant sway over him do not want a deal. According to Gallant, the matter is not parked with us in the defense establishment. It is crucial to move ahead with decisions in the near future. It is important to finalize the process in the coming days before the Prime Minister's trip to Washington or in the course of his visit. After that, it will be much more difficult and complicated. The hostage families reportedly asked for Gallant's advice, and he said for them to try to schedule a meeting with Netanyahu before he leaves for Washington to address Congress later this month. And of course, he will be there 22nd to meet with Biden and then the 24th. So I guess maybe he arrives the 21st or something, so that would give them 3, 4, or 5 days to set up that meeting at this point. The Times of Israel report last week that Hamas agreed to vague enough language that Israel could accept it without committing to a permanent ceasefire, but during the delicate negotiations, Netanyahu has publicly reiterated his demand that Israel must be able to restart military operations and added new demands. We talked about some of that on the show yesterday, and that's really the reason why that the talks just aren't moving forward. All right, let's talk about the GOP. The Party is holding their convention right now in Milwaukee. And so that's, of course, getting a lot of the media attention, and a lot of the attention is now off of Gaza. This was certainly exacerbated by the assassination attempt on Trump's life. Trump did pick J.D. Vance as his vice president candidate. And J.D. Vance is somebody in the past who has expressed some skepticism of the foreign policy establishment. At the same time, I don't see J.D. Vance as somebody who's, especially not as vice president, will revamp the American foreign policy. Maybe this is good news when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I don't think it's good news at all when it comes to the war in Gaza. As far as Vance is concerned, he seems to believe that the U.S. needs to back Israel to the hilt. He was one of the American politicians who since October 7th has made a pilgrimage to Israel and, reinforced his love and support for the war state while there. So I don't see, particularly on the Gaza-Palestine situation, the appointment of Vance, I don't think impacts Trump policies at all. And to the extent it does, it just reinforces Trump's already bad instincts. Like I said, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, the news could be a little bit better, but I'm not going to hold my breath. But let's get into what the GOP is doing at their convention. New GOP platform vows support for Israel, deportation of pro-Palestinian protesters. So the Republican Party posted its new platform last week that's expected to be ratified at the Republican National Convention, which will start on Monday as scheduled, despite the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. Israel is the only foreign country mentioned by name as one of the GOP vows support. We will stand with Israel and we will seek peace in the Middle East, the platform says. Referring to NATO allies, the platform reads, Republicans will strengthen alliances by ensuring that our allies meet their obligations to invest in the common defense by restoring peace to Europe. He reported, a report from an Israeli outlet notes that the same standard of allies investing more money in defense is not applied to Israel. Israel receives $3.8 million in military aid from the U.S. each year and will get an additional $17 billion in 2024, which was included in the foreign aid bill President Biden signed into law earlier this year. Republicans have made an effort to make themselves more pro-Israel compared to the Democrats ahead of the November election, and have strongly criticized President Biden despite his full-throated support for the genocidal war in Gaza. Trump has accused Biden of abandoning Israel and has signaled he will provide strong support for the campaign in Gaza. The GOP platform also targeted pro-Palestinian protesters at college campuses, listing as one of its promises in all caps, this is in all caps, deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our college campuses safe for patriots again. In May, Representative Andy Ogles, a Republican from Tennessee, introduced a bill to deport college protesters to Gaza. I am going to bet that these Hamas supporters won't last a day, but let's give them the opportunity, he said when he put for the legislation. The platform also commits to taking a hard line on China. It says Republicans will revoke China's most favored nation status, phase out imports of essential goods, and stop China from buying American real estate and industries. And so there's a lot of lies and a lot we could break down in there. But of course, it's just all absurd. And I got one more article left today. This one, U.S. launches heavy strikes in Yemen. The U.S. has launched several rounds of strikes on Yemen over the past few days as its war against the Houthis in the Red Sea continues. U.S. Central Command reported fresh strikes on Houthi-controlled Yemen, which were where most of the country's population lives, on July 11th, 12th, and 14th. Yemeni media reported the attacks each day and described them as joint U.S.-British strikes, although it isn't clear if the UK was involved. In the latest attack on Sunday, Yemen's Saba news agency reported 3 strikes in the Red Sea province of Hodeidah. A security source told Saba that U.S. British aggressor aircraft targeted Hodeidah International Airport with 2 raids and launched a raid on the Bashi area of the Al-Odeya district. There is no indication if there is any casualties in the 3 days of U.S. strikes on Yemen. CENTCOM typically claims that its strikes destroy Houthi drones or some other type of military equipment they deem a threat. According to the Yemen Data Project, joint U.S. and British airstrikes killed 16 Yemeni civilians on May 30th, and that's been the bulk of the civilian deaths. CENTCOM has also reported that U.S. naval forces have been downing and intercepting Houthi missile and drones. The U.S. has already spent $1 billion on munitions in its new war with the Houthis, in what it considers and what commanders are calling the largest naval battle the U.S. has been in since World War II. Since the U.S. and U.K. began bombing Yemen in January, the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, have only escalated their attacks on Israeli-linked and other commercial shipping in the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and beyond. There were more Houthi attacks on shipping in June than any other month of the year, so that really suggests that these attacks are not making any difference whatsoever on the Houthis. The Houthis have been clear the only way they'll stop attacks is if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. Tim Lenderking, the U.S. envoy to Yemen, has acknowledged that the Houthis would likely be true to their word, but the U.S. continues to support Israel's genocidal war in Gaza instead of pushing for a unilateral ceasefire. The U.S. backed a brutal Saudi-UAE war against the Houthis from 2015 until 2022 that involved heavy airstrikes and a blockade, and the Houthis only became more capable fighting force during that time. That war killed at least 377,000 people, with more than half dying of starvation and disease caused by the siege. A ceasefire between the Houthis and Saudis has held relatively well since April 2022, but new U.S. sanctions are now blocking the implementation of a lasting peace deal. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Had to keep it a little short today. It's going to be a scorcher here, but I appreciate all of your support, and I know quite a few of you have already donated to the Libertarian Institute Fund Drive, so I really appreciate those of you who have done that. If you haven't yet, head on over and make a donation. We really appreciate it. Back with more shows tomorrow.